Erosion Action Lab. I can interpret topographic maps and satellite views to identify land and erosional features and predict how these features may be reshaped by weathering.
This is Earth, home to 7 billion plus people, 7 continents, and all kinds of amazing plants and animals. This is what Earth has looked like for a long time, and will probably continue to look like for a long time, right? Yes, and no, sure. This is what Earth looks like from space, but even though it looks pretty much the same from whenever we view it from afar, once you zoom in on it, you can see it's always changing. On a small scale, things like moving water shape the Earth's landforms, the natural features of the Earth's surface. On a bigger scale, the gradual shifting of the Earth's crust is slowly moving even bigger things, like the oceans and the continents. So one day, our planet will look different, maybe a lot different from how it looks now. So how exactly does water shape Earth's landforms? Or to bring it back to the spheres we've been talking about, how does the hydrosphere affect the geosphere? To understand that, we need to discuss weathering. I'm not talking about the weather, like if it happens to be sunny or cold or foggy outside your window right now. I'm talking about weathering, the process that takes place as rocks and other parts of the geosphere are broken down into smaller pieces. Weathering can be caused by water, air, chemicals, plants, or even animals, including us. And there are 2 types of weathering you need to know about: mechanical weathering and chemical weathering. Mechanical weathering is the process of breaking big rocks into little ones. Frost, ice, the roots of plants, running water, or heat from the sun can all cause mechanical weathering. Chemical weathering involves the changes that some substances can cause in the surface of the rock that make it change shape or color. Things like carbon dioxide, oxygen, and acids can all cause chemical weathering. And when rocks have been weathered and all broken down and are later moved by natural forces like wind, water, or ice, that's called erosion. Weathering and erosion sound pretty similar, right? Well, yeah, but not exactly. Think of weathering as the hammer that breaks down the rocks. Erosion is the process that carries those rock fragments away, or put in a way we're all familiar with. Weathering helps make a mess, and erosion helps clean it up. Let's take a trip to the beach to see what part the hydrosphere plays in weathering and erosion. This is a picture taken from space of the coastline of Massachusetts in the northeastern United States. It's part of a landform called Cape Cod, and the picture shows what the beaches and islands around it looked like in 1984. Now look at this photo from 2014. What's different? There are actually more islands in 2014 than there were before. Back in 1984, that long strip of land was North Beach. Now, that strip of land has been chopped up into separate islands. The top part is North Beach, the middle area broke off into North Beach Island, and the bottom part is now called South Beach. So, how did that happen? Well, moving water is a major cause of erosion, and there's a lot of moving water in the Atlantic Ocean. The intense energy of ocean waves crashing on shore causes pieces of the rocky, sandy coastline to break into smaller pieces, or to weather over time. Then, natural forces like major storms and rising sea levels then move or erode these smaller pieces. Day to day, you might not notice any dramatic changes, but over the course of 30 years, well, as these pictures show, coastlines can change a lot. So, what can we take away from this? Well, we saw that water can weather and erode Earth's landforms, and that's just one example. There are so many others, like floods weathering valleys or glaciers eroding mountains. Let me break it down for you this way. See what I did there? The hydrosphere shapes and sometimes moves the geosphere. One last joke before I sign off. What did the geosphere say to the hydrosphere? You crack me up.
So in this video, we saw weathering and erosion changing Earth's crustal formations over time. Now we're going to conduct a little lab experiment ourselves and answer these 3 questions in the yellow box. So let's look at some wave action. So what we're going to look for are the effects of waves on the sand. So now we're pouring water into the bucket with the sand, and we're going to look at the effect of waves on the sand in terms of weathering and erosion. So now we're going to make some waves. And what you can see here is the waves are weathering, they're breaking down that sand. And then that sand is being carried away, it's eroding away with the water. So notice how the bottom is eroded first. This is how caves are formed. And so I'm just going to pause it, and then we can answer these questions. The first one we answered, the effects of the wave on the sand, was that the waves were crashing against the sand and weathering it, breaking it down. The process that took place in this model was weathering, the breaking down of the sand, and then erosion, the carrying away of the sand. The water carried the sand away. Number 3, if the waves were much larger, then the shoreline would be expected to decrease much faster. So if those waves were larger than they were, we would expect that shoreline to erode away much faster. That was wave action. So we were looking at the effects of waves on a coastline, on a beach. And here in this picture, you can see how the sand here on the shoreline was eroded away, it was carried away, and now you can see the staircase up to a walkway. Next, we're going to look at wind action and its effects on crustal features. So we're going to model it in this pan and then answer these questions. So the result of the wind action was, so let's look for that question first as I play the video. Wind action. We've created a sand dune on the side. So they're modeling a sand dune, which you see in this picture above here. And some large boulders to the sand dune. So those rocks are representing boulders. So some wind is created by blowing at the sand dune through a straw. So what you can see is the sand is eroding away. It's being carried away by the wind to another place. Notice that the small pieces of sand and sediment move and the larger ones don't. And I'm going to pause it there and we can answer the questions. Okay, so again, wind action. The result of the wind action was, so the wind was carrying away the sand. Some of the rocks were moved by the wind. The rocks that moved were smaller sediments. They were being eroded. They were being carried away. And then lastly, the process that took place in the model is erosion, the carrying away of sediments. Now we're going to look at river action by modeling a river in this pan. So up here in the picture, we have a river, and you can see how the cliffs, the sides of the river have been eroded away, carried away by the water. So we're going to answer these questions after we model river action. So here we're creating a river inside the sand. I'm placing some small rocks to represent boulders next to the riverbed. Okay, pour water slowly down the hill to model the flowing water of a river. So what you see is the water is carrying sediments downward into the base. This is how deltas are formed. So those sediments are being carried away by the water. And you can see at the base of the river it's getting larger. The sand is being deposited to a new place. And I'm going to pause and we can answer some questions. So over here, the action of the water affected the riverbed by carrying sediments to a new place. Gravel affected the erosion of the land by, so the larger pieces of stone were being represented by gravel, and you can see that they were slightly moved when the sediments below them were moved. Sediment carried by the water was deposited down below. So that water carried the sediments and then dropped it, deposited it at the bottom of the river. So this was river action. Okay, so erosion on the mountain. So now we're going to model erosion on a mountain. And up here you can see in this picture that a big boulder was carried, eroded away to a new place. And then we're going to answer these questions. So we're making a convergent boundary. So we're making that soil come together. Notice the mountain is tall and has rough edges. The water being sprayed represents millions of years of rain and erosion on the mountain. And what you can see is that the mountain is eroding. The sediments are being carried away by the water. So the mountain is becoming less steep with less ridges. Notice the edges are smoothed out and the mountain is shorter. So I'm going to pause and we can answer these questions. So the water affected the mountain by making it less steep and smoother surfaces. The material carried by the water moved to a new location. So those sediments are being moved. They were being pulled down because gravity pulls all substances downward. Number 3, planting trees on the slope changed erosion by, so if we were going to plant trees on the sides here, they would actually hold the sediment in place, so it would lessen the effect of erosion. So plants, trees, any type of vegetation is always going to hold the sediments in place with the roots and lessen the effect of erosion. All right, so some analysis questions now. Number 1, as a hurricane moves across the ocean's surface, the surface of the water is moved along as well. Think about what happens to the ocean water as a hurricane approaches the Texas coastline. What effect might occur along the coast? Okay, so the effects that might occur along the coast are, so here in the picture, you can imagine the wave action taking place. And so those waves are going to crash against the coastline and it's going to weather that area. It's going to break down the coastline. And then those sediments are going to erode away. They're going to be carried away. So if there's any type of man-made structures, you can imagine that those would be weathered. They would be broken down by the wave action and carried away, eroded away. So those are some things you can type here in the yellow box. Number 2, sand dunes are located in West Texas near Mononans. The sand dunes constantly change shape and move. What would you expect to be the cause of the change to the sand dunes in the Mononans? How would the sand dunes be affected if they were covered by vegetation? So first, let's look at the first question. What would you expect the cause of the changes to the sand dunes might be? So here in the picture, you can see wind action happening. So the blowing of the wind can change the shapes of these sand dunes. And how would the sand dunes be affected if they were covered by vegetation? Vegetation are plants and trees. So remember, any type of vegetation, plant, tree, grasses can hold down those sediments. So when the wind blows, those sediments won't be eroded away. So if the sand dunes were covered by vegetation, erosion would not take place, or erosion would be less. But sand dunes are always being reshaped by wind. Number 3, in July of 2002, San Antonio and the surrounding area received a week of heavy rains, causing Canyon Lake to overflow the dam. This flooded the surrounding area. The picture at the right shows what a section of the area looked like after the flood's waters subsided, after they went away. If you had to explain to a visitor what happened to the area, what would you say? So looking at the picture, this was after the flood had occurred. So the water now is gone, but you can see that the water eroded. Well, first it broke down, so we can say it weathered away the rock and sediment, and then erosion took those rocks and sediment and brought them to another place. So remember, weathering is the breaking down of rock into sediment, and then erosion is the carrying away of those sediments. So any flood would be water eroding those sediments and bringing them to another place. On a steep sloped mountains, heavy rains may cause a surge of water-soaked rock and debris to slide down the slope. These are called mudslides or landslides. How might this affect the shape of the landscape? So mudslides are caused by heavy rains on mountainsides, and that heavy rain is going to weather, it's going to break down the sides of the mountains, and then erosion is going to carry away those sediments and rock and deposit them into a new area. So this can change a landscape by altering what it looks like. So here you can see maybe a road was once here, but now with the mudslide, all this sediment and rock and debris was moved into the road and it's no longer there. So again, heavy rains can cause debris to slide down. That's erosion, the sliding down of that debris. And again, depositing is dropping it. So we're going to have a look at some STAR test questions on weathering, erosion, and deposition on crustal features. And we're going to look at some satellite images, which are images taken from space, and we're going to see how they might be affected by weathering and erosion over time. So the satellite photo, again, which is a photo from space, shows a large meteorite crater that's 1,200 meters in diameter and 170 meters deep. This crater is located in a flat, arid part of northeastern Arizona. So this is in a very dry part of Arizona. That's what arid means. So there's no water. So we wouldn't really think of water or waves affecting and eroding an area. So how will this crater most likely change over time? So if Arizona is arid and dry, you might think that wind would take action and weather and erode the area on this crater. So would we expect the crater to get deeper as it fills with water? Probably not, because there's no water. It will rise up like a volcano crater. No volcanic activity involved with a crater. It will become less deep as the rim erodes. So around the outside is the rim, and yes, it would become less deep as it erodes because the sand and sediments are going to be carried to another place. It will widen as it fills with lava. Again, has nothing to do with a volcano. So the answer is C, because it will become less deep as the rim erodes. So we can imagine that wind erosion is going to affect the size of this crater, and eventually over time, perhaps you wouldn't even notice it is a crater from a satellite image. This satellite image, again, which is a photo taken from space, shows a portion of the Namib Desert in Africa. This is an ancient sandy desert with dunes that can be up to 305 meters tall. The Namib Desert extends inland from the Atlantic Ocean between 80 kilometers and 200 kilometers and receives only 5 millimeters to 76 millimeters of rain each year. A satellite picture of the same area was taken weeks before, shows that the shape and location of sand dunes have changed. Which of these most likely caused the changes in the dunes? So remember, sand dunes are constantly being reshaped by wind. So blowing wind would be the answer, because again, sand dunes are being reshaped. And in fact, on maps, you can never see sand dunes because they're always constantly changing. So they're never put on a map. And that was the end of our lesson today. I hope that was helpful.